So I picked myself up another Trike. I love three-wheel vehicles, be it RC or full-size. This is, I guess, somewhere in the middle. But this is a pre-made, pre-bought drift trike set. I bought it used, and it was hammered. It had been crashed a couple of times, parts weren't functioning, and it was actually falling apart in the middle. This is a two-piece design of the chassis. The front section is welded, the rear section is welded, but here underneath of the seat there's an overlapping joint that uses 2 bolts per joint to kind of hold everything together, and 3 of the 4 bolts were either missing or stripped, incorrect length, whatnot. So we went through and replaced all the hardware, chased threads where they needed to be, retapped things so that a proper length bolt could go through and clamp everything in place. If we needed to, the plan was to bolt these together at the connection and then weld the joints solid, but at this point it doesn't seem like it's been needed. Now this is a Scooter X, at least that's what it was listed as initially. Looks like you can still buy these, although it does appear that they've changed the design on the rear half of the chassis. Unsure of what other changes they've made over time as well. I believe that this was bought in like 2019 or so, something like that. But it's got a 6.5 horse clone style motor on the back, fat tire front. The foot brake operates the rear caliper, and it's got a hand brake for a front disc. Most of the issues with this was dealing with either missing or incorrect hardware used in many places. Some of the bolts were stripped themselves, but most of the actual hard parts of the chassis seemed to be okay. They just needed some cleaning up with running a tap through the threads. But going through, kind of covering the things that we have fixed, we'll start at the front and kind of work our way back. The front brake, almost non-operational. It's a cable-operated disc brake setup, and the stock front rotor that was on there was a 180mm rotor, but the brake pads on this was only touching the outer, like maybe 5 or 6 millimeters. So I went ahead and ordered a 203mm disc brake, which doesn't quite fit. Took a little bit of massaging on both the rotor and caliper to see if a larger brake disc with more contact area on the pads would help, but it doesn't really help. It was marginally effective, slightly more than the 180, but not a wild improvement. Maybe going to a hydraulic front setup would help. Maybe it's this cable system. That needs a little bit more work, but at the same time, I can't say that I've used the front brake much on this when I used to ride it, when it belonged to a friend of mine. So maybe I still don't really need it, but it'd be nice if it did actually function a little bit better. Going from there, you've got the footrests that come out from the side of the frame here. These again had some missing or damaged hardware that these were just unstable. They rocked a lot, added to the rattling that this thing has. And on the foot brake side, this is the foot brake that runs the rear disc brake setup. That whole pedal assembly was super loose and it was tweaked. I believe that you can actually hit that front brake, or that brake there, when you do have this tire turned all the way. It's probably a design flaw at that. And when you spin out, this can have a tendency to want to whip the wheel around from you. So it's not unheard of to think that this could come over there and touch that again. But at this point, at least, that brake lever has been shimmed so that it doesn't have the incredible amount of play that it did, and the bends have been straightened out to where they should be. Puts it in a nice spot. Everything feels responsive now, and where it feels appropriate at this point. The fact that it comes over and hits the tire, not something we're likely going to change. The throttle linkage on this was one of the major issues. Throttle cable in stock form ran up, kind of came down underneath of the frame, out of the back, and then into the linkage on the motor. Well, being that it ran underneath, if you high centered this over anything, since it does run really low, you can damage the cable, which it did. Also, this had been crashed pretty hard in the rear of the chassis, and it happened to be right where the throttle cable was, and it pinched it, making it pretty much non-operational, which what would happen is the throttle would get stuck at almost wide open throttle. Someone would go to start the motor and it'd want to take off. So a new 90-inch throttle cable was able to be run down, kept out of the way of anything happening from underneath, secured to the chassis on top and into the motor. Now everything functions well there. Throttle return spring works properly. We're pretty much set. The kill switch on this does not function properly. It has another one on the motor itself. It'd be good if this one worked. I do believe that most of the issue is within this little Tamiya style Molex plug here on the down tube, and you can kind of jiggle it to make it work. which in the end, what I'm going to do is probably just replace this whole switch assembly up here with something a little bit different. I just haven't got to that yet. The seat was held on by only a couple of bolts, went through and corrected that, putting the bolts in the proper places and the proper style bolts as well, making it a little bit easier to remove and install the seat. The engine itself didn't need any work other than replacing the throttle cable. It runs fine. It pulls on the first or second pull just about every time. It's not exactly a snappy motor, but it's a pretty standard 6.5 horse Honda style clone. This thing does have a lot of vibration while running it. You're running on a hard plastic tire, so you're going to get a lot of that transmitted through. There is no suspension. It runs through standard kind of pillow block style bearings. And I did check to make sure that the axles weren't, or the axle wasn't bent from impact with a curb or anything like that, which I know that it has come into contact with. I checked run out on it, and it seems to be straight. That's not to say that possibly one of the wheels isn't bent. I didn't check the run out on the inside of one of the wheels, something I could do, but I attribute most of the vibration to just the hard liner on these. These aren't the stock liners that came with this originally. They didn't last very long, so this is just a section of 12-inch pipe that was cut to size and put on there. The cuts on the sides of these tires are also not very straight. Something I'd like to get cleaned up here before too long, but it hasn't been the #1 priority. The clutch on this, the bolt holding the clutch onto the output from the engine was missing, so that clutch was able to walk off, but the chain held it in place, so it didn't want to come completely off because the chain and sprocket were keeping it in place on there. We got a bolt kit for that, replaced it. Hopefully it's holding properly now. The rear of the chassis, where it had taken that good size impact, we straightened that out as much as we could, and now it's looks less damaged. But there's not a whole lot to these things, so at this point it's just ready to ride it. Again, the front brake isn't super operational, and that kill switch, not ideal. These are not super easy to ride. It does take a little bit of practice initially. I've ridden this many times before I actually owned it, so I've got some practice, but I'm going to take it up to a spot where I've never ridden it before and give it a shot again now that it's more tuned up. Alright, that does it for the first extended ride on it. Does pretty well. Those tires heat up a lot, get super chewed up as you can see, but all in all it did fairly well. I think that motor could use a little more power. It's a little sluggish on the response. I guess I could do a Predator Ghost in there like I have on the other trike, but you know, that's a decision for another day. I think this one's a good time for now. I'm sure you'll see it again here soon though. I got some more stuff that I'd like to get done to it. But till then, thanks for watching. See you on the next one.